FM Devout Skeptics. This week, Bel Mooney talks to the scientist Professor James Lovelock.
You've described yourself as an agnostic. Can you start by explaining what you mean by that term?
Yes, agnostic, I suppose, originally means I don't know, to the answer, is there a God? And this really does describe me. I really don't know. The religious people with faith are certain. They know there's a God, and they have faith that there's a God. Equally, right on the other side, are the fundamentalist scientists, and there are a lot of them around these days, who say, we know there's no such thing as a God. Science can explain the whole universe. It's a material thing that's just happened by itself. There's no being out there that's designed anything or made anything. There is no God. I think that position is too extreme, and I'm in the middle. And it's a very broad, open middle ground, and us agnostics occupy it.
A lot of people would be surprised, though. This is because you are a very distinguished scientist, and you've devoted your life to the study of observable fact, of data, and yet at this point, this crucial point, you say, I actually don't know the answer.
Well, it's rather like the reply given by a very distinguished physicist, Feynman, to the question, do you believe in flying saucers? And he answered, I think it's very improbable that they exist. He didn't say, no, I don't believe in them, there's a lot of rubbish. Neither did he say, yes, they may be, I think there's a chance. No, he just said it's very improbable. And this is the same view that I have about the question, is there a God? I certainly never, even from my childhood, believed in the idea of some kind of old gentleman sitting up there in the sky with very bearded, looking down and watching everything I did and giving me a sense of guilt about almost everything. But I don't believe in any kind of human form designer of the universe. Voltaire's notion of man made God in his own image is so true. This is how we make models of the world around us, and we make models of God. But in the case of the world around us, we can match our models with the observable nature. As far as God goes, that's something way out we can't match at all. It doesn't mean he doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist, but we can't know it. We can't say anything about it. So it's best to be an agnostic.
Now, you mentioned your childhood, and I'd like to trace the source of doubt. I mean, was your family agnostic, or were you brought up with any faith at all?
My mother was a Quaker, and I don't know whether you know the Quaker religion, but it's probably the most sceptical religion of the whole lot. The particular meeting that I attended as a child, which was in Brixton in South London, they didn't go much for the Bible at all, particularly not the Old Testament. And they tended to go more by two books the Quakers had called the Books of Discipline, which were mainly accounts of early Quakers dealing with problems, usually humanist problems of imprisonment and so on and so forth, rather than with the standard kind of Christian teaching based on the Bible. And so, in a sense, I was brought up in an atmosphere of rational skepticism rather than religious faith.
And you wrote somewhere in one of your books that your father used to rescue wasps, and because he said that they had their purpose in the universe.
That's right.
Do you think that's where your own fascination with the grand design of the universe began?
Grand design of the universe is too big a term, really. My father was much more down to earth. He was fascinated by the natural world, always had been from childhood, and he was a kind of homespun ecologist, if you like. And he was a very keen gardener. And this is where this wasp statement came, because he had plum trees, and he knew the wasps went for the plums, but he also knew that the wasps spent a lot of their time as predators on some of the more damaging insects that would damage the plants, and he felt that a proper balance required keeping the wasps, not going out and destroying them. Of course, those were in the days before pesticides existed, so he didn't use them to any he just couldn't use them, they weren't around. And so I was lucky. As a child, I was given this background information about nature, and in a way that integrated into the pleasant experience of a walk in the country and going out and enjoying it. And it all became an integral part of my brain, of my life. I think without my father's teaching, I probably wouldn't have developed a theory like Gaia.
Well, I think at this stage we ought to define what it is for the people listening who don't know. Can you just put it very simply, because I know it's a very complex theory?
I'll try, yes. Gaia theory is a theory which sees the Earth as a complete system made up of all the living things, all of them, from bacteria all the way up to whales, from tiny algae living in the ocean all the way up to giant redwood trees, and also the great ecosystems of the forests and so on. All of that life part, not alone, but tightly integrated with the atmosphere, the ocean, and the surface rocks. And the whole of that constitutes a single system that regulates itself, keeps the climate constant and comfortable for life, keeps the chemical composition of the atmosphere so that it's always breathable. There's always the right amount of oxygen in the air. It's very important there should be the right amount. If there was just a little more, fires would be so fierce that all of the forests would be burnt down, just a few % more. If there were less, there would be no forest fires, and this would upset the ecology of the Earth, because it depends on forest fires. So it's a system that regulates itself quite accurately. That's all it is.
Now, I used the word grand design before, which you said was too large a term for your father. But hearing you describe Gaia, which of course is the name of the Greek earth goddess, that sounds like a grand design. Now, it's right, isn't it, that when you first propounded this theory at the beginning of the 70s, end of the 60s, a lot of scientists dismissed it because they said it was, and the word teleological was used, implying a purpose, implying a designing God. Is that right?
Absolutely. And it's very interesting that you should have said it seems like a grand design. That's just what they thought I was saying. I wasn't saying anything of the kind. I was saying it's a system that evolved automatically, without any purpose, foresight, or anything. It just happened, and has been in existence now for about 3.5 to 4 billion years. Very tough system.
But that being the case, and you reject this idea of the grand designer, were you shocked then that at the time bishops praised you? You were taken up by theologists with a lot of praise.
I was indeed, yes. I was just amazed by it. I never forget one the most extraordinary occasion. Just after my first book was published, I had a telephone call here from a man, and he said, "You won't know me, I'm Jim Morton, Dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York. And I've just read your book. I got an advance copy of it, and I'm fascinated by it. Do you think you could give a talk to a small group here in New York sometime not in the not-too-distant future?" So I said, yes, I'd be delighted to, because I was due to appear in New York for the publication of the book a couple of weeks later. So I said yes. And his small group consisted of the communion service in the morning at the cathedral. I was to give the sermon. Scared out of my wits at first, but it was a most wonderful experience, really, getting all dressed up and marching down the cathedral aisle, being introduced by the bishop and having to give the sermon. And I suddenly realized, of course, the churchmen have it all set up for them, the acoustics of a cathedral and the position of the pulpit as such, that it's easier to speak from there than I've ever spoken in any scientific lecture theatre. Somehow it carries you forward. And it all seemed to go quite well. I warned them that it would be an entirely secular sermon. There would be no mention of God in it, because I couldn't compromise
Did you
myself.
feel that you were there on false pretenses? Because they had actually misunderstood what you were saying.
No, I didn't, because I think they had understood what I was saying, and I think this is one of the interesting things. I think the theologians are a little bit ahead of the scientists these days. They're a little less dogmatic than the scientists are, and that particular group in that church in New York was certainly far less dogmatic than many of the biological scientists are nowadays.
In a way, you were ahead of your time, weren't you, in seeing the wholeness of things? The word holistic is used a lot now. But it occurs to me that there's a sense in a way in which you were only expressing a knowledge which people have had for centuries. You know, there's that green man figure which appears on Christian churches. It's a pagan symbol, isn't it? That there was a sort of a belief in the essential unity of things even then.
Oh, I think so. Well, it goes all the way back, I'm sure, when men and women could first think about the world around them. They were bound to have wondered if it was something that was almost alive. And I know my biological colleagues are always jumping on me when I say, imply even that the Earth is alive. This is not what I'm implying in the sense alive like an animal. What I'm implying is alive in the sense of being able to regulate itself in the way that you keep your temperature always at 37, except when you have a fever, or when you're dead, when you cool off. The same way with the Earth, it's always kept its temperature close on to where we are at the moment, not far off 20 degrees Celsius, a bit below it at the moment. It was a bit above it in the past epochs. But during all of that time that there's been life on the Earth, the sun has increased its output of heat by 25%. And so it's a remarkable thing that it's always kept constant. It's like going from living in the Arctic to living in the tropics. You keep your temperature constant because you're alive. So does the Earth. But alive not in the sense like a cat or an animal, just a self-regulating system.
Now, you use the word remarkable, which implies a sense of wonder at these things. Is that important to you, that you are a scientist? I was about to say, with the prejudice of the artist, despite being a scientist.
Fair
you retain a sense of wonder.
Oh, of course. I wanted to be a scientist from about 4 years old onwards, and everything, I was always questioning the nature of things, and it was with a sense of wonder always, and pleasure on finding answers. I found the teaching of science at schools absolutely abominable, almost designed to drive it away from the child's mind, and had I not learnt most of my science by reading books from the Brixton Public Library before I ever went to grammar school, I doubt whether I would ever have become a scientist.
And do you think one of the problems is for modern man in search of a soul, which is the name of a book by Jung, isn't it? That, in fact, the discoveries of science, the rest of us left in some sort of ignorance, but knowing that these discoveries have been made, has left us without God. God has been banished from our horizon, and there is nothing to take his place.
It's not that the scientific approach is bad and it's taken God away from us and given us nothing. I think the scientific approach is wholly good. It spins off from a sense of wonder, and wonder is, after all, is what it's all about in the origins. If you have a hypothesis there's a God, that's only one hypothesis, and it may not be right. There are others. Looking at it scientifically, you keep an open mind until you have so much evidence that it's overwhelming and you're fairly sure you can believe in something. So, no, I think what's happened is that scientists have betrayed science rather than that the method itself is wrong. Since science became a career, a job where you went to for 9 to 5, where you had a pension, security, employment status and so on, it lost its soul altogether. Science is a vocation, like the arts. I mean, can you imagine an institute of fine art where painters went along every day and clocked in to do their painting? The whole thing's absurd. But we expect science to go on that way.
And I'm just interested in the development of the person who is you, in the sense that when you were a little boy and you looked at a snowflake or something, did you ever think that someone had designed it? Was there any bent towards you, towards the sense of a God at all, ever?
No, could never find any image of God in my life. The Jesuits used to say, give me a child before the age of 7, I think, and we have him for life. And it's very true. But it works with science also, you see. My father, wise man, on my 4th birthday, gave me, that would be 1924, I think, gave me what would amount to a kit nowadays of electrical parts, bits and pieces. There's some batteries, wire, Bell, light bulbs, and all sorts of things. He said, there you are, join up those and see what you can make of it. And it was a wonderful present, and I loved it. And I remember going round and asking people, including the postman afterwards, why is it you need 2 wires to send electricity along? Why won't one do? You can send water or gas down one pipe. Why should you need 2 wires for Nobody, of course, could answer. But it kind of indicates the sort of question that being given that thing at that early age had started moving in my mind. And I think I was then insulated against faith or dogma from then on.
Did it surprise you, or does it surprise you, that throughout the centuries, millions and millions and millions of people in every culture you can imagine, from the primitive to the most highly sophisticated, have required God?
Yes, it does make me wonder, because I don't really know the answer, and I don't think anybody does.
So you don't really understand that need?
I would acknowledge that it's there, and that for me it's fully satisfied by a sense of wonder about the universe. I've no depression at all associated with there is no God, why am I here? It's all pointless, it's all automatic, I'm just a thing that's going to terminate and not too long a time, and it doesn't it's never bothered me. I think one of the great weaknesses of modern life is we're all structured to think of time. We don't live for the minute, as primitive people do. And one of the great things of working in the way we do here in a freelance manner is that we don't know what next year's going to bring. So there's no point in fretting about pensions or things, or job security or anything. We don't even know what 3 or 4 months are going to bring. And it's been like that for 30, 40 years for me. I hated it when I had tenure and full employment as a scientist. I could see tram lines of security going right down to retirement and the grave. It's an appalling prospect. And I think that modern life, which makes people value tenure, value their insurance policies and all of that kind of thing, is what makes them so miserable. They're kind of reminded every day that life is finite.
Now, if in all your studies of the life of the Earth, as well as life on Earth, you rejected and reject the idea of the purpose being that of God, what about a universal spirit of nature, the kind of thing Wordsworth and Coleridge celebrated? The idea of a life force running through all things?
Well, I think that's woolly liberalism, to be quite honest. I mean, I think it's more honest to have a monotheistic God up there as a postulate. It's a little more testable than this kind of vague universal spirit of nature. I know what they're on about. It's the kind of lovely warm feeling you get when you go out on a nice sunny morning like this morning and hear the birds singing and smell all the may trees and the freshness of it all. You're bound to get feelings which many people would call religious or something. I don't feel any need to do that. I'm quite happy to enjoy it. I don't want to explain it.
I'm going to have to defend them here, because I think it was slightly more than appreciating the prettiness of trees. It was seeing nature as a moral force, which is the thing when King Lear shouts, "Here, nature, here, great goddess, here." And that doesn't seem to me to be very far removed from your theories of Gaia, which requires of us a moral sense about the universe.
No, your point's very well taken. Indeed, you can use Gaia as a kind of moral metaphor. The nature of the world system is strangely like the attributes given to the ancient goddess of Gaia, or the ancient Indian goddess Kali. They were both of them feminine, kindly, nurturing, taking care of, but also they were quite ruthless towards transgressors. And Kali drank the blood of humans from a skull. And if we go on messing about with the planet, it may well be, metaphorically, our fate. The rules of the game in Gaia are that if you live well with the world and the environment, and if you tend to improve it, your progeny will flourish. If, on the other hand, you make the environment unpleasant, you pollute it, corrupt it in any way, then the Gaia view is that you will be eliminated, because your progeny will not succeed so well.
It seems to me as you speak that the organized religions of the world and the kind of pantheism which was felt by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and your kind of science have one thing in common, which is the awareness of the need for humility.
Absolutely. And one of my main quarrels with modern science is the opposite. It has the opposite of humility, hubris, overweening pride. It goes right across the board. You'll find many a physicist nowadays who, if you interview him or speak with him, will give you the impression that yesterday he was speaking to God, and this is what God said for his ears only. And you'll find biologists, likewise, who are will come out with statements saying, science can explain everything. This is extraordinary hubris by my reckoning, shows a total absence of humility, and makes us fail to understand that we are a fairly lately evolved animal on the earth, just an animal along with all the other animals. We're not that clever. I mean, we should wonder, for example, what on earth the great whales, with their brains 10 times as large as ours and full of functioning cells, are doing. They may be much more brilliant than we are.
Do you reject humanism as a philosophy?
Yes, very much so. Very
Why?
much so. I think it's a self-limiting and self-destructive philosophy, unless we recognize that we are part of a great community of organisms that make up this system Gaia that I'm talking about. Assuming that it's a fair description of the Earth, if we don't realize that we're part of that, we will tend to do things which are good for people only. And if we do that, then people will die. You see, the rules of the Gaia game, you must look after the Earth. If you don't do that, then the Earth will take care of you, in the sense of eliminate you from the scene.
Yeah, as it may be taking care of itself, and you will pay the price.
It will always take care of itself. And we will pay the price. So humanism is a self-defeating philosophy.
You use the word animal to describe us, and obviously we are animals. Does then the word soul have any meaning for you?
Yes, very much so.
How do you define the soul?
I'm not going to define it because my only feelings about it are a scientific intuition that there is a state in the mind which corresponds to many of the ideas of the soul, but it's no more than a mental state. Like, the only analogy I can give you is a modern one, and it's probably a very poor analogy, and that is when you have a computer on your desk and it's switched on but there's nothing in it, there's no programs, there's nothing working. In a sense, it's alive. In an electrical sense, it's switched on and functioning. But when it has a program running in it, there's nothing's been that you could measure's been added to it. You couldn't weigh it, the existence of it or anything. But it's something that is there in the idea space of the computer that is an entity in its own right. It's such an entity it can even be attacked by viruses, as you probably know. And I like to think of the soul as a similar class of entity within the idea space that the hardware of the brain constitutes. So yes, I'm not at all unhappy with the idea of a soul, although it may be very different from the concept of a soul held by many a theologian or a religious person.
Is that because you don't believe in the ongoing life of the individual soul? In other words, life after death?
Oh no, I've no evidence for that at all. Things you believe in require some solidity in the natural world. Otherwise you're wasting your time, you're spinning wheels.
All your life's work has been to do with the life of the Earth, with life itself.
That's right.
Do you contemplate the end of life?
Oh, it's bound to happen as far as this planet goes, because one of the ineluctable things of the solar system is that as the sun grows older, it gets hotter. It's one of those strange kind of bonfires that gets hotter as it ages. But eventually, it will be too hot for life as we know it on Earth. And eventually, it's a fairly long time in the future, not as long as you'll find in most textbooks, which put it at 5 billion years, it will suddenly grow up into a red giant and vaporize the planets. That's the wrong way to look at it. It's been warming up ever since it was born, and it's continuing to do so, and I would guess in 1 to 2 billion years the sun's output of heat will be too much for any form of life on Earth to sustain an environment in which it can exist.
When you talk about the end of life on the planet in that way, you do so with great equanimity. Does it fill you with horror?
No, how can something that's going to happen in 1 or 2 billion years fill one with horror? All sorts of nasty things that will possibly wipe out the human race are bound to happen before that. We get planetesimal impacts about, on the average, about every 60 million, 30 million years. And these were the things that are thought to have caused the great extinction of the dinosaurs and so on 65 million years ago. But they've been going on at regular intervals ever since the Earth existed, and they'll go on into the future. So we have no tenure on this planet, nothing automatic about it. It's the same with I'm not bothered about human death. It's inevitable. It's something that'll happen, but why worry? It's not going to happen in the next minute. Not likely.
When you talk in that way and in that tone, it's clear that you're talking about your own death in a way which is remarkably sensible. I imagine that you are someone who's suffered bereavements, the loss of people you loved. Isn't that harder to contemplate? And to
The loss of loved ones?
Yeah.
Oh, well, of course it is. No question. I think one should enjoy and love those around you while they're here, not when they're gone. It's a negative thing to grieve too long.
So the responsibility is to live for the now.
Yes, very much so. As it's the only way to live. And I think many of the great religions, of course, give this as advice, as proper advice. Take no thought for the morrow, consider the lilies. They toil not, neither do they spin. It's not a new idea. It's an old one.
When you look up at the sky at night here in Cornwall and you're in the most beautiful surroundings and completely peaceful and miles from anywhere, and you look up at a beautiful starry sky and the moon's up there, do you look up and think, wow, that's beautiful, and just accept it, or do you still wonder about it, and if you like, ask